Good morning, everyone. This is Father Kilian speaking, and welcome back to class. I wanted to just to give you a bit of, we haven't got too many classes left, just a couple really, but I wanted to give you a kind of an overview of how things are going to be shaping up. I've been thinking about the question of final exams. That seems to be been buzzing around amongst the faculty. I keep getting all kinds of emails from various faculty members trying to decide how best to handle the final exams with this online teaching experience that we're all having. And I was thinking that I'd like to have you, and I haven't worked it out yet, but I will have it to you by next class, something a lot clearer than I'm expressing right now. And that is, I want you to be thinking about the actual experience that you're undergoing right now during this pandemic experience that we're all having. And then I'm also going to try to have you relate that experience to maybe one or two of the works that we've studied. So it'll be very general in some ways, but I want it to be very sort of personal. So you're speaking out of your personal experience during this really unusual and unique time for all of us. So I'll have something really clearly sort of set out for you. And then if, of course, you have any questions or anything at all that you're not clear about, we'll be always happy to clarify, keep you in the know. I just wanted to wrap up the last short story of O'Connor's that we worked with, and that is Everything That Rises Must Converge. She wrote that short story in 1965, and I don't think any of you are old enough to remember, but 1965 in this country was a very tumultuous, very difficult time, particularly dealing with racial issues. And it was just throughout the whole country. The country was pretty much kind of wrapped up in turmoil over those. There was a lot going on. So in some ways, this particular story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, is an expression of that period. And I wanted to especially draw your attention to the title of the story, Everything That Rises Must Converge. As I've explained to you briefly before, this title is taken from the works of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a French priest, paleontologist, who speculated that the evolutionary process that was going on with human beings was producing a much higher and higher level of consciousness among people. And his theory was ultimately this consciousness would, in its spiritual nature, would be completed by its merging with the divine consciousness at the omega point. It's a little bit difficult to grasp, I think, sometimes, but that was the point, that somehow we have the possibility, we have the offer of the graces for us to recognize ourselves much more clearly and our purpose in life than we might otherwise would imagine. And so in this particular story, you have this young college graduate by the name of Julian taking his mother on the bus. And what we discover about him is that he seems to express, as we listen to him, as he's telling us, that he's this liberated, open-minded person in the midst of this period where there is so much prejudice and so much racist attitudes that were in existence. And of course, he points us toward his mother as an example of a racist and of a narrow-minded person, one that is sort of polluting the country with her racist attitudes. But as we listen to him and as we watch him from the side, sitting across from him on the bus, if you can imagine yourself being there, we suddenly discover as we see into his inner thinking that he really is himself a racist. He's one that is sort of hankering for the days of the plantation. He's grieving over the loss of the abundance that they had as plantation owners, his ancestors. And he seems to be angry and bitter about all of that. And so as he's sitting in the bus, he starts to think about ways in which he could sort of annoy his mother, or at least point the mother's what he considers to be her racist attitudes. And as we listen to him, we suddenly discover that he, in fact, is the one who is the racist. And then we know the rest of the story as they get off the bus. And then there is also the lack of tolerance on the part of the African American woman who takes her handbag and basically kills Julian's mother. That struck her, creating some kind of a stroke that she had, and then she ultimately dies, we assume, in the story. But what's also going on at that same time is that the little boy, the woman's little 4-year-old child, suddenly is able to identify with Julian's mother, that there seems to be an innocence between the two. And that tells us something about the nature of Julian's mother, that she may have some attitudes about racism, and she might have some sort of particular positions that she's holding regarding the white race and the black race, and yet at the same time she has a compassionate heart, and the little boy recognizes that in her, unlike the African American woman who is angry and is intolerant of what appeared to be Julian's mother's gesture of kindness to the little boy. She wasn't speaking down to the little child or to his race, but it came out of an act of kindness. So that's the whole question of mutual forbearance is really at the heart of that story, and the importance of being open and gracious to everyone. I think that's what O'Connor was getting at in the story. And then she never makes any judgment about whether or not Julian actually changes at the end, or he continues to be this racist sort of young person. But we can sort of assume his sudden sort of weeping over the loss of his mother and the sadness that he experiences, and one begins to assume that perhaps he does realize, he finally comes to realize that he is an angry, sort of hypocritical, self-pitying individual, and that this moment of crisis, this tragedy, is what enables him to finally recognize himself for who he really is. And I think we find that same kind of experience in probably most of Flannery O'Connor's short stories, that the person who thinks he or she is above everybody else, or that those that carry these attitudes oftentimes are confronted by oftentimes violent and tragic sort of confrontations, and they're sometimes recognized as they are the source for the illuminating grace that O'Connor believes is a gift from God, that God is offering this gift of grace to the individual, and it's up to the individual to receive it and to accept it or to reject it. We never quite know how a person receives it, or whether accepts it or rejects it. We don't really know. She never comments on that. It's left up to the reader to try to decide or to figure out how that works. So anyway, I just wanted to just kind of wrap up everything rises that converges, and the tension between what is in fact racist attitudes amongst, say, the people we see on the bus, and Julian's mother and Julian. They're the two, and in some ways, the two protagonists. We're given the impression that Julian is the liberated, open-minded individual, the mother is a racist, when in fact, as we listen closely, we find out it's basically just the opposite. And I think that's one of the gifts that Flannery O'Connor has, to be able to help us see more clearly what is and what it is supposed to be. Okay, so the second part of today's meeting is that I wanted to just have us focused for our next class, her story, Good Country People. And one of the things I want you to be thinking about seriously, these are the 4 or 5 questions that I have. As you read the story, what is the relationship between Helga, that is the protagonist of the story, or Joy as her birth name is, but she changed it to Helga. What's the relationship between Helga and her mother, Mrs. Hopewell? What is, as you listen to them talking, and you listen to their comments and their reflections and their thoughts, what would you say is the relationship between the two women, the mother, Mrs. Hopewell, and her daughter, Helga? Secondly, how have Mrs. Freeman, that is the hired woman that comes every morning to the kitchen, and Manly Pointer, the Bible salesman, how do these two characters serve in the story as a source of illuminating grace for Mrs. Hopewell and for Joy Helga? What is their function? How do they serve as a source of this illuminating grace for both of those characters? And then another question I want you to be thinking about is that Helga professes to be an absolute atheist. She believes in nothing other than science. And yet she quotes the 17th century Catholic philosopher Malebranche, and you'll find that quotation on page 276. Malebranche, who claims we are not our own light. And apparently she underlines that, and she stresses that, repeats that idea. There's something greater beyond us, a power beyond us. Malebranche believed that even the simplest of bodily movements and gestures were only possible because the supernatural power that is constantly present in human life. And so she claims that, she yells back at her mother that we are not our own light. And yet at the same time, this character is claiming to be an atheist. Okay, so think about that for a few minutes. What's going on there with her? Another question is Mrs. Hopewell, that is the mother, keeps pointing out that both Manly Pointer and Mrs. Freeman are good country people. How does that title, as it's applied to these two characters, how does that work in the story? She keeps referring to them as they're good country people. What's behind that? And then finally, at the end of the story, the last question I want you to be thinking about is what really is going on there at the end between Helga and Manly Pointer? I mean, we know what happens once they're up in the hayloft. We know what happened. But what do you think O'Connor was implying with all of that? what do you think she was suggesting? How would you evaluate the story once you read the encounter between both the mother and the hired woman, Mrs. Freeman, Manley Pointer, the Bible salesman, and Hulga, the protagonist of the story? At the end of the story, how would you, what would you see as being the important aspect of the story as we see it finished at the end? And what I want you to do, especially as we see Hulga at the up on the hayloft, and as soon as he disappears with her artificial leg and everything else that he's collected, as she turns and looks out of the open space of the hayloft onto the lake outside, what does she actually see? And how does color and names help us to see a bit more deeply into the story? Okay? So anyway, think about that for our Wednesday's class, and then I'll give you some more questions on Wednesday to be thinking about Friday's class, and that will be our very last study, and that is Revelation. Both of these stories are really fascinating and really interesting, and I think they require us to try to use all of the imagery, all of the setting, the names, the titles, whatnot. Using all of that helps us to see the story a bit more deeply. Okay, so I think that's probably all for this morning. And again, I always, and I know Brother Damien expresses the same thing for you. We're hoping that you're all well and you're healthy, and that you're all keeping your spirits up and not to become discouraged. This will pass, and with God's blessings, we'll have no more of the sorrow and the sickness and the deaths that have been occurring because of the result of this virus. Okay, so goodbye, and God bless you.